The Justice Department this past week filed a suit over immigration's new immigration law. Joining us from San Diego is Representative Darrell Issa. He is the ranking Republican on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee here on our Newsmakers this week. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for taking up this important subject.
Two reporters here to help with us with the questioning this morning, Jake Sherman of Politico and Suzanne Gamboa with the Associated Press. Suzanne has the first question.
As she said, the administration has filed a lawsuit challenging Arizona's immigration law, a new law that's supposed to go into effect July 29th. You called that disgraceful, and you said it shows contempt for immigration laws and for the people of Arizona. I was wondering if you could tell us why you disagree with this law.
Well, I think when we look at it as an entire failure over decades, failure since the 1986 amnesty to ever secure the borders on an interior basis, when Arizona decided to take advantage of existing federal law that allows their people to sift through, if you will, people apprehended for some other reason, and then offer to turn them over to law enforcement on a federal level, that should have been greeted with a welcoming, thank you very much, that's why this program exists, that's why since for more than 12 years, Orange County, California has had a program in their jails to try to not re-release, if you will, people who are both criminals and illegal immigrants.
Well, Congressman, you talked about a failure over decades, and you have taken the administration to task over this law. You've sent a very harshly worded letter with some Republican colleagues. But it's clear on Capitol Hill that there needs to be some Republican cooperation on this law, if, you know, on national immigration legislation. So where do you think Republicans are? We haven't really seen Republicans kind of rush to Democrats to craft some sort of compromise in this Congress or even the Congress before. So what good do these letters do if there's no work on Capitol Hill for this decade-long failure, as you put it?
Well, it's longer than a decade, Jake, but basically the positions are well mapped out. We have only one red line, which is we're not going to do another round of amnesty, period. It didn't work in '86, and it simply incentivized mostly the friends and relatives and people from the same communities that had been granted amnesty the first time to come here in large numbers, mostly from Mexico. And this, by the way, was on top of 500,000, mostly family reunification immigrants that we accepted a year, many of whom were family reunification from people who were granted amnesty. So that's a clear position of the Republicans. After that, everything else is in play. A full guest worker program that would allow whatever number of people could gainfully be employed without displacing American jobs. Certainly a transition for people already here so that they could either be converted to guest worker or exit the country in a fair way. All of that is in play. At the same time, both Republicans and Democrats, Congress and the President, have over a period of time enacted laws like E-Verify only to have them not used or not enforced.
So just to follow up on that briefly, could you characterize the discussions you've had with Democrats? Because it hasn't really seemed like Republicans have been rushing to the table to craft any compromise on this, and again, nor have Democrats.
Nothing could be further from the truth. The problem is it's a minority of Democrats that are willing to say, I will do immigration reform without a pathway to citizenship, which is the Democratic way of saying amnesty. On the Republican side, we get hammered. We get nasty letters if we talk about a solution that isn't simply deport them. So yes, there needs to be fair reasoning that both are unacceptable. Straight deportation of 12 million people overnight is unlikely and probably almost impossible to do. But E-Verify, causing people to not be able to get new jobs if they're illegally in the country, could be implemented, and it could dramatically reduce the number of people here and allow us to begin to see how many jobs really could be offered to guest workers.
There are advocates that say, as long as Congress continues dragging its feet, however, something like E-Verify that could make a difference in enforcement doesn't get done, and something like finding out who is here illegally, getting them to register, getting them to pay back taxes and to pay $1,000 fine or whatever the threshold is, that doesn't get done either, and there's sort of a de facto amnesty going on as long as Congress doesn't do anything. What do you
Well,
say
there's
to
no
that?
question. Yeah, there's no question that there are millions of Americans, native-born, born of people illegally in this country. That you're creating a generation of American citizens who are children of illegals. There's no question that's going on. But going back, Suzanne, to E-Verify, Lake Elsinore, a city in my district, has tried to mandate employers to do it. Arizona, part of the law that's being challenged is simply saying if you want a job in Arizona, every Arizona company has to verify that you're legally in the country. So here's a federal program designed before I entered Congress and passed with the work of Ken Calvert, a neighboring congressman from me, that in fact Arizona simply says we want everyone to do it, and the administration says not so fast. Well, what do you mean not so fast? Why in the world should American jobs be offered to people illegally in the country when Congress more than a decade ago passed a law that allowed for employers to know that someone is illegally in the country and not hire them, or certainly not continue to employ them?
Can I just follow up? Do you consider allowing people to pay back taxes, requiring them to become proficient in English, some of the other things that have been thrown out there, paying a fine? Do you consider that to be amnesty? You mentioned a transition for people already here, so I'm trying to just clarify.
Well, that's it, Suzanne. That's a transition home or a transition into a guest worker program that does not have a permanent citizenship or pathway to citizenship in it. That's the Republican position, 97%. But understand that when someone says pay your back taxes, so on top of being an illegal, you're a tax cheat. That is similar to what happened with Al Capone. He says, well, you know, I'll pay my taxes. I didn't know I had to. Excuse me, if somebody is in this country working around taxes, many illegals are working and paying their taxes, but if they're working around taxes with an employer who's paying cash under the table, I've got a tax cheat who's an employer, I've got an illegal who's working around it for all cash and taking all the cash, and you're telling me that we should allow them to remain here? That's illogical. What I've said all along, from the time President Bush said there are some jobs Americans won't do, I've said that I have no problem with quotas of even millions of guest workers if there are jobs Americans won't do, once they know those jobs are available and that American citizens and permanent residents get first dibs at those jobs. That's the way it is everywhere else in the world. The only reason it isn't that way here in America is we really don't know. When you're putting 50 people on it for a roofing job, you don't know whether they're legal or illegal, so that $22 an hour job with benefits is going to whoever happens to apply, even if they don't have a right to be in the country.
So what would you say should be done for the people, should be done with the people who are here illegally, the estimated 11 to 12 million, including a few million children? There are some people who espouse this idea of doing a roundup like what was done in the by the Eisenhower administration, and it was an operation that was unfortunately named Operation Wetback. Are you supporting that kind of operation?
Well, I think when you look at the Arizona law and the administration pushing back on not a roundup, but on taking people already apprehended for some other violation of the law and saying, if we catch you doing something wrong, we're going to scrutinize you and deport you. That would seem to be a great starting point, so that if you have people unlawfully in the country, they don't drive drunk, they don't drive without insurance, they don't drive with expired plates, and they don't commit other crimes, and they don't join gangs. Wouldn't that be dramatically improved for the people of those minority neighborhoods who today often are living in a gang neighborhood backed by people illegally in the country? That's a simple starting point that the administration is pushing back on.
Let's talk a little bit about how states should handle this. You indicated again that this was a failure of the federal government. Would you encourage more states to enact laws like this? I mean, it seems like there has been a failure both under Republican and Democrat administrations and Congress to do something nationally. Is this something that the states will have to take in control for the foreseeable future?
Well, I think the states should work cooperatively with the federal government. In other words, no sanctuary cities the way we have in California. That's something that Meg Whitman has been pushing, that we've got to at least end the outright support of illegal activity by some of our cities in California. So that's a good starting point. Don't help people break the law. Basically, though, it is a primary federal responsibility. For years, I've said that the fact that we have people who are illegally in this country sitting in our jails in California is reprehensible. They should be transferred to federal custody, serve out their time in federal prisons, and be deported. It shouldn't even be a state responsibility. And yet, in California, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars every year are spent and unreimbursed by the federal government for incarcerating people criminally in this country, not just as criminals for being here, but criminals on top of that.
Congressman, that's the crux of the federal lawsuit, though, put forward by the Justice Department, that the federal government has the responsibility and the authority over this type of issue, and that the Constitution says that where the federal government is dominant and where there exists already federal regulations, that a state cannot preempt that.
You know, Suzanne, people who quote the Constitution tend to be selective when they quote it. The administration's being selective. First of all, the Supremacy Clause has been well understood to be a state cannot be contrary to one of the two tests. They can't be contrary to the federal government. In this case, the state of Arizona is totally supportive of the federal government. They're simply aiding the federal government in doing their job. Every day, for interstate car theft, drug dealing, and all kinds of other areas, the federal government relies, even in federal cases, on state help and support and cooperation, and they get it. So when you want it, you say, well, supremacy, we're working together. When you suddenly don't want it, you claim, well, it's exclusively ours. The federal government, if it has a right, has a responsibility. If they don't meet that responsibility fully, and the state attempts to assist them in meeting that responsibility, remember, Arizona is not incarcerating people for being illegally in the country. They're offering them up to the federal government to take their responsibility, and it's giving them, you know, if you will, on a silver platter, the job already done. It's not sitting at the border. Arizona is not going down to the border and apprehending people as they run over the border. They're looking at enforcing it at the work site and when they apprehend somebody for some other crime. There's no question at all. That is supportive of the federal laws. There already are a number of laws that were passed to support exactly that. The administration can't have it both ways. They can't have E-Verify. They can't have these programs where they're supposed to take criminals and pass them over to the federal government if they're illegally in the country, and then say, but if you do it wholesale so it actually works, we're going to come after you. That's unacceptable, and it certainly is a misuse of the Supremacy Clause, and I'm convinced that the Supreme Court will rule that way, that you can't stop a state within its rights from asserting its sovereignty in support of federal law as long as there's some state nexus, which clearly there is.
But there are some law enforcement people who believe that if you are able to weed out some of the 12 million people who are here, who have not committed heinous crimes, their one infraction, crime, whatever you want to call it, violation is crossing the border without permission and coming to work here or coming to live here. And they believe if you can weed out those people, they can better use law enforcement resources to target people who are committing crimes, people who do want to do harm to this country. So why not get the kind of enforcement you want, the E-Verify with biometrics, more ICE in the interior, cracking down on employers or workplaces? Why not get that by negotiating something with the party in power for a comprehensive immigration bill?
Suzanne, all you're saying is why not give amnesty in order to get a promise of enforcement? We did that in 1986. We didn't get it. It's very clear that what we're willing to do is give a guest worker program for millions of people without prejudice toward whether they've been in this country previously in return for enforcement. But that's a guest worker program. It's a program where people come out of the dark, they register, they send their extended families home, they work here, and they go home to Mexico or Guatemala or wherever else once a year in an orderly fashion. And by the way, this is what my farmers here in California have been begging for years. They want an organized guest worker program so they can have workers for the period of time they need, pay them above the table fairly. There's no question there are jobs available and there are workers available, mostly from Mexico, that can be paired up. Republicans support that pairing, but they want it done under the law. There's no question that the Democrats want another wave of new Democratic voters. This has been part of their plan. and law enforcement that say they'd like to work on something else, they deserve a program, but they don't deserve an out on enforcing existing laws.
Congressman, if I can just get into the politics of this briefly.
Sure, Jake.
Proposition 187, which you did not vote for, correct? You've said that you did not vote for Proposition 187 in 1994 in California. It drove Hispanics away from the Republican Party, and Hispanics were driven away from the Republican Party again in 2008 when Barack Obama was on the ticket for president. Could you talk about the politics of this? Republicans have been supportive of the Arizona law by and large, and Hispanics have been overwhelmingly against it. So could you kind of talk about the politics of that and how that will play out come November?
Well, Jake, one of the most famous quotes of Ronald Reagan is that Latinos are Republicans. They just don't know it yet. And I think that drove a 1986 amnesty by Ronald Reagan. It drove a decision to do the right thing, to get this conflict between, if you will, the parties and a group of people who came here for jobs and resolve it. It didn't work. It didn't work because there's no end to how many new immigrants, poor immigrants, the Democratic Party would like to have filling their ranks to displace, if you will, voters who are coming to the Republican Party over time. That's the politics of it. In the case of 187, 187 was a frustration by the people of California, like Arizona, and by the way, a great majority, 2-1, that we had to do something, that this was ridiculous and it continued to be absurdity. They were right. 187 was conceptually right. Do I think that, that going into the schools and trying to find the children, most of them legal immigrants or legal-born Americans, was a good tactic? No. But there's no question that the worksite enforcement and people coming for a handout at the taxpayer's expense at a welfare office should have, and now, by the way, are supposed to be prohibited from receiving those services. So I do think parts of 187 absolutely were right. The federal government wasn't doing their job, and the people of California were then and are now, including many legal citizens from Latino citizens, whether they're from Guatemala or Mexico or other places, they're frustrated too because they're seeing their ability to move up and enjoy the American dream often stifled by an endless amount of people willing to work under the table for less without any kind of control. Everybody needs a system of laws. Republicans are perfectly willing to have a large guest worker program, but it's got to be under the law, and it cannot include automatic amnesty. Remember, Jake, we have 500,000 people who are being united, mostly Mexican and South Americans, with people who are already here every year. We have 500,000 new immigrants that fit the category that people are talking about granting amnesty for. It's pretty easy to say, are we going to make that 1 million or are we going to make it 400,000? We can have that debate about how many people we allow to immigrate here, but it shouldn't be clouded with people who say they only want a job temporarily. And I think that's a very, very good point. Suzanne, you didn't talk about the racial profiling that are so often asked about. Mm-hmm. And I want to share something with you. In my district, and there's a few others around the country, there are 2 checkpoints, one on Interstate 5 and one on Interstate 15. Every day, hundreds of thousands of cars pass, and Border Patrol agents 70 miles north of the Mexican border look at people's eyes and either wave them past or stop them with no crime asserted except that they're possibly illegally in the country. If you want to have a case for racial profiling, it's trying to figure out how a Border Patrol agent decides to stop somebody without probable cause simply because they, quote, might be illegally in the country, knowing that a red-haired Russian would be hard to find if they were illegally in the country. So they're mostly looking for brown faces and Mexicans. They do that every day. Arizona is not doing that. They're picking people up for other crimes that in the ordinary course, and then they're saying, is this person legally in the country or not? So if President Obama wants to deal with racial profiling, he can come to my district, he can look at that, and he can determine whether or not, no matter how trained somebody is, they can look into the eyes of somebody driving by in a car and legitimately decide. And oh, by the way, I don't think those border checkpoints are constitutional. I don't think they ever have been, but they were ruled constitutional back in the 30s because we were sparsely populated in this area of millions of people today. So, you know, I'd love to have President Obama come and talk about racial profiling, but talk about how the Border Patrol does business 70 miles inside America. Don't talk about Arizona, who's already apprehended somebody for some other reason and says, oh, by the way, let me see your ID and whether you're in the country legally.
We have about 5 minutes left here.
Congressman, to move briefly away from immigration, Michael Steele, the head of your party.
No. The head of the Republican National Committee, not the head of my party.
You're a Republican. And so, is this somebody who should remain as the top executive of the RNC?
Michael Steele is supposed to reflect a consensus of Republican platform and policies. If he does that, he certainly could remain. If he's not willing to do that, if he wants to be a political leader on his own, there's plenty of seats open in November. I'd suggest he run for one of them. And I feel very strongly that he is not my leader. He does not make policy for me. The fact is that the National Republican Congressional Committee is made up of elected Republican leaders, 178 or so of us, and you know, we elect our own leaders and we figure out what our policies will be going into November, and we're figuring out how to get jobs going in America, get the government out of owning corporations and distorting markets, and that's what we're focused on. We're focused on jobs, we're focused on the business of the people from a congressional standpoint. So I'm sorry that Michael Steele has become the news, because he's a bubbling up of state national committeemen, and he's supposed to execute on behalf of their decisions and their platforms. He doesn't represent me. I don't side with the statements he's made. But at the same time, I hope that he can realize that he should be a consensus explainer for the Republican Party across America, which I think would be very helpful. I certainly think Haley Barbour did a superb job of it when he was the chairman, because he was a chairman realizing he spoke on behalf of consensus. He didn't make up policy.
So it's not your position that he should step down. You think he should stay as the chairman of the RNC?
Jake, I think he has to make a decision, and everybody at the RNC has to make a decision. Are they going to speak on behalf of the consensus of Republicans, what we've already established as policy? If so, that's great. He can do the job. If he's not willing to do it, then I think he should resign. He has to decide which he's going to be. You know, the National Committee, as far as I know, has never said anything about Afghanistan being Obama's war at all. And I suspect that you could find lots of those. And that's the important thing, is he's not supposed to be, nor am I supposed to be, a single spokesperson for the party. I speak on behalf of my committee and the men and women who work with me. It's a very limited role, but I was elected to do it, and I'm going to do it. At the same time, I'm not going to cross the line into policies that are outside of established policies for my party. I think that's foolhardy, because we're having people, independents, come to Republicans and see us as the party of smaller government and fair execution of the Constitution. That I want to stand for.
I have to go back to the racial profiling question and or
yes, Susanna.
Discussion, but are you saying that you don't think racial profiling will occur when the Arizona police or local officials or law enforcement are making their arrests? That there won't be any racial profiling?
Well, what I'd say is that to the extent that they're only picking up people and that are already committing other crimes, why would there be any profiling? They're picking up the same people they're always picked up. The difference is
but isn't
that
there
now
wide
they're checking them
latitude in the
further.
law? Isn't there wide latitude in the law in terms of what they can be picked up for, in terms of whether it's a crime, violation of a local ordinance? Contact, I think, is a key word in the law. I realize that the amendments say no racial profiling should occur, but we're talking about human beings. And I just kind of wonder how you reassure a minority community that has a history and can go back in their history from their parents, and not just Latinos, but African Americans in this country, where racial profiling has occurred, and where they have had, you know, local law enforcement target minority communities, sometimes unfairly. How do you reassure them that this isn't going to occur with this law?
Well, the amazing thing is, since the only penalty can be applied if you're illegally in the country, if somebody's going to pick you up for jaywalking, you know, and you're not illegally in the country, there's no secondary penalty. If there's a pattern of actual abuse anywhere, and understand it would be one policeman or one small part of the state of Arizona, if that occurred, then the Justice Department looks at that pattern, comes in with a heavy hammer for that discrimination. But never before have we challenged something because it might lead to something. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says a state is limited to what it absolutely won't do and can be stopped from what it might do. There's no question that discrimination continues around our country in minority communities, including Black and Hispanic. And we need to have real enforcement. But for the Justice Department to ignore real problems around the country and spend time going after a state who simply says we're going to self-help consistent with existing federal programs that have been passed under Republican and Democratic presidents is pretty absurd. If President Clinton saw no problem with E-Verify, why is it that suddenly when we want to mandate it for everybody, it's racial profiling? Where's President Clinton saying, well, look, I thought it was a good idea and I signed it into law. President Bush allowed it to be expanded. This Congress has not tried to limit it or reduce it. Just the opposite. They've tended to say, yeah, E-Verify is a good thing, but it appears as though E-Verify is only good unless it's used.
Representative Darrell Issa, we'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you for being our newsmakers. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.